Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. The scent of cold, salty sea fog wrapped around the bow of the small transport ferry, heavy and suffocating like a damp wool blanket draped over the world. I stood alone near the rusted iron railing, letting the freezing mist settle against my cheeks, watching the mainland disappear into a wall of impenetrable gray. The rhythmic, guttural churn of the diesel engine vibrated upward through the wet metal deck, sinking into the soles of my boots, and sinking with the hollow, exhausted thud of my own heart. I did not look back toward the city. There was nothing left for me there, only the ghosts of a life that had been quietly dismantled piece by piece. Choices vanish quickly. When you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. Arthur Vance had not been a deliberately cruel man, merely a desperate and utterly defeated one. When his final financial collapse threatened to leave us, with nothing, the massive leather-bound debt ledger was presented to me, not as a threat, but as a transaction. A single signature in sharp black ink in exchange for the total erasure of his insurmountable liabilities. That singular stroke of a pen had commodified my entire future, transferring my father's ruin into a formal marriage contract with a man I had never met. I had been sold to a private island in the remote Pacific Northwest, fully expected to serve as the quiet, obedient collateral to a reclusive billionaire. I gripped the icy railing tighter, my knuckles turning stark white under the strain, half expecting to feel like a prisoner being ferried to a medieval dungeon. But as the small boat lurched violently over a deep, rolling swell, the captain stepped out of the narrow wheelhouse. He was a deeply weathered man, with heavy lines etched around his eyes, and salt and pepper hair tucked neatly beneath a faded wool cap. He did not look at me with the cloying, invasive pity of the mainland lawyers who had drafted the contract, nor did he avert his gaze in the cowardly shame my father had shown. Instead, he stepped forward and reached down to secure my single, scuffed leather suitcase with a quiet, solemn respect. He offered a short, firm nod, treating my journey like a conscious, dignified choice rather than a tragic, helpless sacrifice. It was a remarkably tiny gesture, yet it sent a sudden line of warmth down my spine. I lifted my chin, letting the freezing wind whip my hair across my face. I refused to arrive on this island as a victim. The estate emerged from the dense fog like an ancient fortress carved directly out of the earth itself. Dark, towering pines clung stubbornly to the jagged rocky cliffs, their heavy needles dripping with perpetual coastal rain. The house was a sprawling, imposing structure of deep gray stone and thick, weathered timber, devoid of the ostentatious, sterile luxury one might expect from a modern tycoon. There was no glittering glass facade meant to showcase immense wealth, no manicured lawns meant to impress visiting dignitaries. There was just raw, unyielding survival standing defiant against the harsh elements of the sea. The ferry docked smoothly at a heavy wooden pier slick, with green algae and sea foam. I walked up the winding gravel path alone, the weight of my damp winter coat growing heavier across my shoulders with every step. At the massive iron-bound oak front doors, a woman stood waiting in the shadows of the deep porch. Clara Thorne, the estate's housekeeper, wore a thick knitted cardigan over a simple dark dress, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She did not bow, nor did she offer a grand theatrical welcome meant to establish some rigid hierarchy. Her greeting was an incredibly soft, observant nod, her intelligent eyes taking in my shivering frame and the pale exhaustion in my face, before she quietly stepped aside to let me enter the vast sanctuary of the foyer. I braced myself to meet the tyrant. I fully expected a cold, calculating man, looming in a dark, mahogany-lined study, ready to inspect his newly acquired financial asset with a critical eye. Instead, the cavernous entry hall was empty, save for the distinct, rhythmic sound of water steadily dripping onto the cold stone floor. I found Julian Ashford kneeling near the base of the massive arched doorway, intently focused on a puddle forming near the masonry. He wasn't dressed in a pristine bespoke suit or surrounded by scurrying assistants. He wore a heavy, dark woolen sweater, the thick sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms corded with dense muscle and marked by faint, older scars. He was quietly, methodically inspecting a leak where the relentless coastal rain had finally breached the ancient stone. He wiped his damp, calloused hands on a rough cloth, slowly rising to his feet as he heard my boots against the floorboards. Julian was a tall, undeniably formidable presence, his features sharp and heavily shadowed, his expression completely unreadable behind a thick wall of winter stone. I stood perfectly still. I waited for the arrogant command. I waited for the possessive, sweeping gaze of a man who owned everything he saw. Instead, he tossed the damp cloth onto a nearby wooden bench with a quiet sigh. "The western wind pushes the rain straight through the old mortar," he said. His voice was low, heavily gravelly, carrying the deep, bone-aching exhaustion of a man who had fought far too many quiet wars. He didn't look at me as a piece of property, secured by a legal document. He looked at me simply as a weary traveler who had unfortunately been caught in his personal storm. "Mrs. Thorne has prepared your room on the second floor, looking out over the eastern cove. You have full freedom of the island grounds, Elena. Do not ever feel confined to this house." He did not step closer to intimidate me. He did not ask for a trembling smile, and he certainly did not demand any performative gratitude. He simply stated a practical fact, handed me back the fundamental agency my father had sold, and immediately returned his quiet attention to the cold, wet stone of the leaking wall, the relentless, deafening crash of ocean waves hitting the rocky cliffs below the dining room, vibrated directly through the soles of my shoes. Evening had descended rapidly over the remote island, turning the tall, arched windows into sheer black mirrors that reflected the flickering light of a dozen thick pillar candles. The dining room was vast and heavily shadowed, anchored by a massive mahogany table that looked as though it had been hewed by hand from a single ancient tree. There was no delicate, fragile porcelain set out to impress me, no gleaming crystal, meant to show off an untouchable, intimidating wealth. Everything in Julian Ashford's world felt deliberately heavy, designed to withstand an endless emotional and physical siege. We sat at opposite ends of the incredibly long table, the physical space between us mirroring the vast psychological chasm of our arrangement. The silence in the room was immense, heavy with the unshakable weight of the financial contract that legally bound us together. Clara Thorne had quietly left a simple, hearty meal of roasted root vegetables and wild-caught salmon on the heavy wooden sideboard. Refusing to hover in the corners like a subservient maid, we were expected to serve ourselves. The only sounds in the cavernous space were the muffled, rhythmic roar of the sea outside the thick glass, and the occasional soft clink of silver utensils against heavy earthenware plates. I kept my eyes deliberately focused on my food, analyzing the exact psychological distance separating us, while I took small, careful bites. I had spent the last 2 months preparing for this exact night, fully expecting harsh demands. I had expected a clinical, humiliating lecture on my expected duties as a debt bride, or, at the very least, a cold reminder of exactly how much money Arthur Vance had cost him. Instead, mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. Julian did not stare at me. He ate with the slow, methodical focus of a man who treated food as mere sustenance, rather than pleasure. His eyes cast downward toward the scarred wood of the table. Halfway through the silent meal, Julian finally set down his fork. The movement was incredibly deliberate, immediately drawing my highly guarded, defensive attention. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, slowly reached into the deep pocket of his dark trousers, and withdrew something heavy. With a dull metallic thud that seemed to echo off the high stone ceiling, he placed a large ring of keys directly onto the center of the mahogany table. They were not modern, electronic key cards or lightweight aluminum. They were thick, antique brass and heavy, dark iron, their jagged teeth worn remarkably smooth by decades of quiet use. He pushed the heavy metal ring across the polished wood with 2 fingers. It stopped just a few inches from my glass of water, the brass glinting softly in the warm candlelight. "This estate has 34 doors, Julian said, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle flame rather than my face, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "That ring holds the master lock to every single one of them, including my private study in the west wing, including the heavy iron front gates at the edge of the property, and, most importantly, including the thick steel deadbolt on the inside of your bedroom door." I stared down at the jagged brass teeth, my heart faltering painfully in my chest, as my mind struggled to process the sheer magnitude of his statement. A cold, transactional husband did not hand over the literal, physical keys to his empire on the very first night of a forced marriage. He certainly did not offer his newly purchased captive bride the explicit means to lock him out of her personal space. I had spent countless sleepless nights, building an impenetrable iron fortress inside my own mind, preparing to survive the deep humiliation of being owned and controlled. I had expected a warden who would monitor my every breath. I slowly reached out across the table, my trembling fingertips lightly brushing the cold metal of the largest key. The heavy iron was freezing against my skin, yet the incredible gesture carried a strange, unyielding heat that completely bypassed my defensive armor. He was deliberately surrendering his physical control over my environment. He was guaranteeing my safety, not with hollow, grandiose, romantic promises that could be broken by morning, but with cold, undeniable brass that I could hold in my own hands. I looked up through the dim, wavering candlelight, quietly studying the harsh, intensely stoic lines of his face as he stared out toward the black windows. He wasn't a cruel warden, keeping the rest of the world out just so he could keep me trapped inside as a helpless prisoner. He was a deeply scarred man who had built a massive stone fortress solely because he was hiding from the world himself. And for the very first time since my father signed away my life on that ledger, I felt the tight, suffocating grip of pure fear finally begin to loosen its heavy hold on my lungs. The icy temperature of the sea wind stung my cheeks. The moment I stepped past the heavy iron front gates of the estate, it bit through the thick wool of my coat like invisible, sharp needles. It had been exactly 3 days since my arrival on the remote island. Already, the absolute, profound silence of the place had slowly begun to settle deeply into my bones. There were no blaring city sirens here, no ringing phones, and no aggressive creditors relentlessly pounding on the front door to demand their money. The debt ledger my father had signed felt like a distant, fading ghost. It lingered somewhere in the dark shadows of the sprawling stone house, but it was never spoken of aloud. Julian Ashford had kept his word with an unyielding, rigid discipline. He did not summon me to his private study. He did not demand my presence at meals, though Clara Thorne always ensured the heavy mahogany dining table was meticulously set for 2. Instead, Julian was a phantom in his own home. He was a fleeting silhouette I only caught brief, passing glimpses of from a distance. Sometimes I saw him chopping heavy firewood near the eastern storage shed. Other times, he was studying architectural blueprints in the expansive library, with the heavy oak door left deliberately ajar, or standing completely still, staring out at the turbulent Pacific from the edge of the high stone terrace. Instead of feeling abandoned or neglected, a profound, overwhelming sense of relief washed over me. My father had traded my life to clear his ruined name. He had treated my entire future as a mere mathematical equation required to balance his insurmountable liabilities. For months, I had been fully preparing myself to be heavily micromanaged. I expected to be paraded around high society galas as a newly acquired trophy, or to be locked away in a suffocating, gilded cage of sterile luxury. But this private estate was not a cage. It was a vast, wild sanctuary of dark, towering pines and crashing, violent gray waves. For the very first time in years, I was allowed to simply breathe. I was permitted to exist without having to constantly justify my own worth or defend my personal boundaries. By the second week of my quiet isolation, a comfortable, grounding rhythm had formed. I walked further down the rugged shoreline every afternoon, pulling my heavy collar up against the bitter, relentless chill of the incoming tide. The rocky beach was an unforgiving, brutal landscape of jagged gray stone. It was littered with massive, twisted pieces of driftwood that had been bleached by decades of salt and sun. It was a treacherous place that demanded careful, deliberate footing. Yet I found myself deeply drawn to its raw, unpolished beauty. I carried my sea glass jar tucked into the deep pocket of my coat. I treated the simple object as a quiet rebellion against the sterile, calculated world of high finance that had brought me here. While Marcus Sterling and the mainland corporate vultures valued people solely based on their financial net worth, I spent my quiet days searching the whetstones for discarded things. Every single piece of broken glass I found was a silent reminder. It proved that even the most shattered, useless fragments could be slowly, meticulously worn down into something beautiful and immune to the sharp edges of the past. I knelt beside a cluster of dark, slick boulders, my numb fingers sifting methodically through the icy, wet pebbles. The deeply earthy scent of crushed pine needles mixed heavily with the sharp, metallic tang of the freezing sea spray. It filled my lungs with a grounding, absolute cold. I found a small, perfectly frosted piece of white sea glass, no larger than my thumbnail, and dropped it into my container. The soft, crystalline clink echoed softly against the deafening roar of the surf. It was a tiny, private victory in the overwhelming vastness of the coast. I was slowly filling the vessel, piece by broken piece, anchoring myself to the physical reality of the island. If I stopped moving, I knew the crushing humiliation of my past would catch up to me. The memory of Arthur Vance pushing that financial contract across his desk was a dark, suffocating tide I constantly had to outrun. He hadn't even been able to meet my eyes, as he legally sold my autonomy to save his own pride. As I navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of the cliffside path, the damp, yielding earth gave way to slippery, moss-covered rocks. My heavy winter boot suddenly lost its grip. I stumbled forward, my arms flailing wildly in the freezing mist. My knee slammed brutally hard against a jagged edge of protruding slate. A sharp, blinding jolt of pain shot up my leg. It forced a quiet, involuntary gasp from my lips as I desperately caught my balance against a wet, rough pine trunk. I stood there for a long, agonizing moment, my chest heaving. The freezing rain began to mix heavily with the salty sea mist resting on my eyelashes. The island was breathtakingly beautiful, but it was entirely indifferent to human fragility. It did not care if I was a powerful billionaire's wife or a ruined man's desperate collateral. I brushed the dark, wet soil from my coat, testing my weight on my throbbing, bruised knee, and prepared to turn back toward the safety of the warm stone estate. But as I rounded the narrow bend to take the safer upper dirt trail back to the house, I stopped dead in my tracks. Resting on the flat, even surface of a massive rain-slicked boulder was a small, highly deliberate arrangement. It sat directly in the center of the narrow path I walked every single afternoon. I limped closer, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. The icy wind was momentarily forgotten as I stared down at the dark stud. Someone had painstakingly gathered a handful of sea-polished green glass. It was the rarest, most elusive color on this specific stretch of the beach, pieces I had spent countless hours quietly searching for, without any success. The smooth, emerald-colored shards were laid out in a perfect, precise circle against the wet rock. They gleamed like tiny frosted jewels under the heavy, overcast sky, and sitting dead center inside that ring of rare green fragments was an insulated stainless steel thermos. I reached out with a trembling hand. My numb fingers lightly brushed the thick layer of dark, textured fabric wrapped tightly around the metal cylinder. It was a piece of heavy, dark wool, precisely cut and meticulously stitched to insulate the metal against the freezing coastal air. The faint, familiar scent of cedarwood immediately identified the unseen architect of this quiet, impossible scene. I slowly unscrewed the lid. The metallic scraping sound was sharp and distinct against the ambient, chaotic noise of the crashing waves. A thick plume of fragrant, warm steam immediately rose into the freezing mist. It carried the deeply earthy, bitter aroma of fresh pine tea, mixed with a subtle, soothing hint of wild honey. He hadn't approached me on the beach. He hadn't demanded my immediate attention, nor had he expected a performance of trembling, vocal gratitude. He hadn't tried to buy my trust with an ostentatious display of limitless wealth. There was no hollow, grandiose romantic gesture that would have felt like just another calculated transaction. He had simply observed my daily routine from a quiet distance. He noticed the freezing temperatures I was stubbornly enduring to collect my glass, and he left a quiet, tangible source of warmth, exactly where he knew I would inevitably find it. I cupped the hot metal lid in my freezing, raw hands. I let the immense heat seep deeply into my aching joints, taking a slow, tentative sip. The hot liquid burned beautifully down my throat. It slowly thawed the deep, internal chill that had settled in my chest long before I ever set foot on this remote island. I stood alone on the edge of the rocky cliff, staring out at the violent, churning gray sea, holding the insulated vessel like a physical lifeline. He wasn't asking my movements to assert his dominance or control my world. He was quietly watching to ensure I survived the bitter cold. He had given me a massive, unyielding stone sanctuary. Now, through the silent language of practical care, he was quietly teaching me how to stay warm inside it. On the 14th night, the storm that had been brewing offshore all afternoon finally broke entirely over the island. The rhythmic, low thrum of the tide against the shore at midnight echoed through the thick stone walls of my bedroom. It was a constant, restless heartbeat that refused to let me sleep. A violent, freezing rain lashed furiously against the tall, arched window panes. I lay entirely still, beneath the heavy, goose-down comforter, my eyes tracing the dark, shifting shadows dancing across the high sea-ceiling. The master ring of keys Julian had placed on the dining table still sat untouched on my bedside nightstand. I hadn't locked my heavy wooden door once since arriving. The psychological barrier he had dismantled on that very first night had proven far stronger than any physical iron deadbolt. A sudden, sharp sound cut violently through the steady, droning roar of the wind and rain. It wasn't the natural expected crack of a falling pine branch, nor was it the hollow boom of a wave hitting the deep coastal caves. It was a rhythmic, metallic thud, a deliberate heavy strike of solid iron against wet wood. I threw off the warm covers. A deep frown pulled at the corners of my mouth as I crossed the cold hardwood floor in my bare feet. I pressed my palm flat against the freezing glass of the tall window, peering desperately out into the chaotic ink-black night. The eastern cove was mostly swallowed by absolute darkness. But down near the edge of the steep cliffside, exactly where the damp earth gave way to the treacherous, moss-covered rocks that had caused me to stumble days before, a single, harsh beam of industrial yellow light cut fiercely through the driving rain. Someone was out there working in the middle of a freezing midnight squall. I didn't stop to think. I didn't change clothes or pause to consider the absurdity of wandering the massive estate grounds in the pitch dark. I grabbed my thick wool coat, pulling it hastily over my simple white cotton nightgown. I shoved my bare feet into my heavy winter boots and hurried down the grand, sweeping main staircase. The cavernous stone foyer was completely dark, save for the faint, ambient glow of the exterior security lights, bleeding through the glass panes. I pushed open the heavy oak side door, bracing my entire body as the brutal, icy wind immediately whipped my hair across my face and forcefully stole the breath directly from my lungs. The cold was absolute and unforgiving. It bit deep into my exposed skin as I marched down the muddy, winding gravel path toward the cliffside. The rain was coming down in heavy, blinding sheets, rapidly turning the solid ground into a slick, treacherous mess of mud and crushed pine needles. As I drew closer to the harsh beam of the halogen work light, the sharp metallic thuds grew louder. They echoed with a fierce, driven intensity that easily pierced the noise of the coastal storm. I stopped at the edge of the dense tree line. My hand tightly gripped the rough, wet bark of a towering pine, my breath catching hard and painfully in my throat. Julian was on his knees in the freezing mud. He wasn't wearing a protective rain jacket or specialized heavy gear. He was wearing the exact same dark woolen sweater from the day I arrived, now completely soaked through and clinging heavily to the dense, corded muscles of his broad back. He was drenched, his dark hair plastered flat against his forehead. Rainwater ran in steady, uninterrupted streams down the sharp, harsh angles of his exhausted face. He held a heavy iron hammer in his right hand, forcefully driving thick, galvanized steel nails into a series of massive, freshly cut wooden planks. He was building a staircase. He was actively, painstakingly constructing a reinforced wooden walking path directly over the slippery, moss-covered rocks where I had bruised my knee. I stood completely paralyzed in the freezing downpour. My mind struggled to process the raw, undeniable reality of the scene unfolding in front of me. This was Julian Ashford, a man whose name alone carried the massive, immovable weight of old money and generational privilege. He was a man who could have picked up a phone and commanded a fleet of luxury landscapers to pave the entire coastline in imported stone before dawn. He could have hired entire crews to sanitize the island, removing every single jagged edge, just to prove his dominance over the natural environment. Instead, he was out here at midnight, kneeling in the freezing torrential rain. He was driving heavy nails into wet timber with his own 2 bare, blistered hands. I watched him reach blindly for another nail, his repetitive movements driven by a rigid, almost punishing determination. He positioned the thick plank of wood, his jaw tight and locked with intense concentration, and swung the heavy hammer down. But the relentless rain made the metal incredibly slick. The heavy tool glanced off the flat head of the nail and slammed brutally hard into the edge of his left thumb. Julian dropped the hammer into the mud with a heavy, wet thud. He let out a sharp, guttural curse, a raw, completely unguarded sound of pure pain and intense frustration that was instantly swallowed by the roaring wind. He sat back heavily on his heels, gripping his injured hand tightly against his broad chest. His broad shoulders heaved as he closed his eyes against the driving, freezing rain. It was in that singular, fractured moment that the intimidating, untouchable billionaire ceased to exist. The pristine illusion of high society power and the terrifying, unyielding warden my father had so casually sold me to shattered instantly into a million insignificant pieces. The man kneeling in the mud was simply a man. He was a deeply scarred, fiercely protective human being who was utilizing raw, punishing manual labor as his only available language of care. He didn't know how to write flowery, poetic love letters. He didn't know how to stand in a warm, perfectly lit room and offer empty, grandiose vows of affection. He only knew how to take a heavy iron hammer to the sharp, dangerous edges of the world so that I wouldn't trip and fall. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. It waits in the freezing rain, holding a hammer in the dark, bleeding quietly just to ensure you never have to stumble again. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the pine trees, the wet gravel crunching softly beneath the soles of my boots. I didn't announce myself, and I didn't speak a single word. I simply walked forward into the harsh, yellow glare of the worklight. The icy rain soaked instantly through my thin cotton nightgown, beneath my open, unbuttoned coat. His head snapped up aggressively at the sudden sound of my approach. The moment he saw me standing there in the freezing rain, his intense, heavily guarded expression fractured entirely. A flash of genuine, unmasked panic crossed his usually unreadable features. It wasn't because he had been caught performing a vulnerable, humble act of service, but because I was standing entirely exposed to the brutal, freezing elements. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded. His low, gravelly voice tore through the ambient noise of the coastal storm. He didn't wait for my answer. He scrambled desperately to his feet, ignoring the thick mud coating his knees and the dark blood welling rapidly on his bruised thumb. In 3 massive, purposeful strides, he crossed the short distance between us. His large hands immediately caught my shaking shoulders as he turned his broad back to the wind, utilizing his own massive body as a towering, physical shield against the driving rain. "I heard the hammer," I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly as the freezing wind bit viciously through my wet clothes. I looked past his broad chest, my eyes fixing deliberately on the half-finished wooden path. The heavy iron nails gleamed wetly in the harsh yellow light. "You're fixing the path, because I fell." Julian stared down at me, his chest heaving with heavy, labored breaths. Freezing water dripped heavily from his dark lashes, trailing down his rigid jawline. He looked entirely cornered, as if my quiet, observational statement had permanently stripped away the last remaining layer of his winter stone armor. He didn't offer a smooth, calculated excuse to protect his pride. He didn't try to dismiss the monumental weight of his actions as a simple, routine landscaping task. "The moss is treacherous in the wet season," he said finally. His voice dropped into a rough, exhausted whisper that completely betrayed his stoic posture. His large, warm hands tightened fractionally on my shivering shoulders. They radiated an impossible, grounding heat directly through my damp coat. "I heard you cry. I didn't like it." I stared up into his dark, intensely focused eyes. The deafening roar of the raging ocean faded into the silent background. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of his whispered words hit me far harder than the freezing rain ever could. He hadn't just observed me from a safe distance. He had been actively, closely listening. He had cataloged a single, quiet gasp of pain from a woman he barely knew, and his immediate, unyielding instinct was to physically alter the earth itself to ensure it never happened again. "You're bleeding," I whispered, reaching up slowly. My hand trembled as I moved to touch the side of his hand. My cold fingers brushed gently against his rough, calloused knuckles, slick with rain and dark dirt. Julian looked down at our momentarily joined hands, his expression intensely guarded, yet impossibly soft. He didn't pull away from the unexpected contact. He didn't flinch or retreat behind his usual walls of silence. Instead, he slowly, deliberately turned his injured hand, allowing his long, freezing fingers to fully encase mine. The contrast of his rough, burning palm against my frozen skin was a shocking thaw, a sudden heavy anchor of warmth in the absolute middle of the freezing storm. It was not a demand for affection. It was a complete silent surrender of his pride. "Go back inside, Elena," he murmured. His thumb lightly brushed the back of my freezing hand as his gaze remained intensely focused on my pale, shivering face. "Before you catch your death in this storm, I'll finish this and follow you in." I looked at the heavy iron hammer lying abandoned in the freezing mud and then back up at the fiercely protective, deeply traumatized man, holding my hand in the pouring rain. The debt ledger my father had signed was a sterile, transactional lie. The absolute truth of my new life was standing right in front of me, bleeding quietly in the dark to keep me safe. "No," I said quietly. My voice was surprisingly steady and clear, as I tightened my grip on his hand, anchoring him firmly in place against the storm. "We are going back inside. Together. The path can wait until morning." For a long, deeply tense moment, Julian simply stared at me. The heavy rain washed over the harsh lines of his face, as he searched my eyes for any sign of fear, pity, or transactional obligation. He found absolutely none of those things. I was not his captive, and I was no longer afraid of the massive stone fortress he had built. Slowly, the tight, unyielding line of his jaw finally relaxed. He gave a single, incredibly soft nod. His broad shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, as he allowed me to gently pull him away from the unfinished wood, away from his solitary, punishing labor, and back toward the warm, quiet sanctuary of the stone house. The deafening roar of the coastal winter storm rattled the tall, arched window panes with a violent, unrelenting force. We hurried up the wet gravel path, bowing our heads against the brutal gale, until we finally reached the shelter of the deep porch. I leaned my weight against the heavy oak front door, slamming it shut behind us to cut off the wind's deafening howl, but the moment the iron latch clicked into place, absolute darkness completely swallowed the massive stone foyer. The mainland power grid had finally surrendered to the freezing rain, severing the estate's last remaining artificial tether to the outside world. There were no backup generators roaring to life, no automated security lights, suddenly flooding the cavernous halls. The silence inside the house was absolute, contrasting sharply against the chaotic wind that violently battered the eastern stone walls. The sprawling, ancient stone fortress was instantly reduced to a cold, primitive cave. The drop in temperature was immediate, sinking into the very marrow of my bones as the ancient stone absorbed the winter chill. Julian did not curse the sudden darkness. He did not reach for a phone to demand immediate repairs from terrified mainland technicians. Nor did he exhibit the fragile temper of a man accustomed to absolute control. He simply moved through the pitch-black space with the quiet, practiced certainty of a man who had spent years navigating his own shadows. I stood shivering violently near the entryway, my wet cotton nightgown clinging uncomfortably to my freezing skin, listening to the heavy, steady thud of his wet boots against the hardwood. A sudden, sharp scrape of a match echoed through the vast room. A tiny flare of golden sulfur illuminated the harsh, exhausted angles of his face. He knelt before the massive, open stone hearth in the center of the main living room, methodically arranging dry kindling and thick, split logs of coastal pine. He worked with a silent, rhythmic efficiency, his large hands carefully building a structure that would catch the small flame and turn it into a lasting source of heat. Within minutes, a roaring fire cast deep, dancing shadows across the high vaulted ceilings. The amber light chased the freezing dampness back into the far corners of the room. We sat on the thick, woven rug directly in front of the flames, entirely separated from the sterile luxury of the estate. Clara Thorne had long since retired to her private quarters in the West Wing, leaving us in absolute, uninterrupted isolation. The storm had acted as a massive, violent equalizer. It forcefully stripped away our societal armor, completely erasing the transactional dynamic of the debt ledger my father had signed. In the raw, flickering light of the hearth, he was no longer an intimidating, untouchable billionaire, and I was no longer a commodified heiress, traded to settle a financial ruin. We were simply two freezing human beings, sharing a single source of warmth against the end of the world. He had managed to locate a simple, rustic loaf of dark bread and a heavy wedge of sharp, aged cheese from the kitchen pantry. He sliced it with a thick, iron-handled knife, placing the utilitarian meal on a wooden cutting board between us. There was no fine china, no silver cutlery, no performative dining etiquette to uphold. I pulled my wet knees tightly to my chest, my teeth chattering silently, despite the rapidly growing heat of the fire. The bitter coastal chill had sunk far too deeply into my bones during my desperate run to the cliffside. I wrapped my arms securely around my waist, fighting a violent shiver that completely betrayed my attempts to appear resilient. The man across from me paused, the heavy iron knife stilled against the worn wood of the cutting board. He looked up, his dark eyes instantly locking onto the minute, involuntary tremors shaking my small frame. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a hollow, generic apology for the cold, nor did he step aggressively into my personal space to force his body heat upon me. Instead, he stood up slowly, the firelight catching the faint, exhausted slump of his broad shoulders. He unbuttoned the thick, wet woolen sweater he had been wearing outside, discarding it onto a nearby leather chair, leaving him in a simple dark Henley that clung tightly to his chest. Then, he reached for the cedarwood coat he had left, draped over the stone mantel, earlier that evening. He stepped back into my line of sight, closing the physical distance between us with slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath, entirely unsure of his intentions. He did not crowd my space. He did not ask for permission, nor did he linger to demand an uncomfortable display of gratitude. Julian simply stood behind me and gently draped the massive, heavy garment over my shaking shoulders. The thick material settled around me like a protective iron vault. It carried the intense, residual warmth of his body and the deeply grounding, familiar scent of cedarwood, crushed pine needles, and clean rain. The moment the heavy fabric encased me, he immediately took a full step backward, deliberately restoring the exact psychological boundary he had just crossed. It was the same quiet, observational care he had shown when he left the insulated stainless steel thermos filled with hot pine tea on my walking path earlier that week. I pulled the wide lapels tighter around my neck, closing my eyes as the immense soothing heat slowly seeped into my freezing skin. The sheer weight of the coat felt like an unspoken promise. It was not the calculated, possessive move of a powerful corporate titan securing a financial asset. It was the quiet, instinctual defense of a protector offering sanctuary. He bought this remote island to keep the entire world out, to build a massive stone wall against human connection. Yet here he was, actively dismantling his own defenses to ensure I did not freeze in the dark. I watched him sit back down on the opposite side of the heavy cutting board. The flickering flames cast deep, shifting shadows over the dark, bruised skin already forming on his knuckles from the hammer strike. We ate in absolute silence. The only sounds in the cavernous room were the violent, rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffside, the howling wind rattling the glass, and the soft, comforting crackle of the burning pine logs. It was a profound, heavy quiet, but as the minutes stretched into hours, the suffocating tension that had defined our arrangement slowly began to dissolve, melting away like the frost on the window panes. The silence was no longer a weapon we used to guard ourselves. It had transformed quite suddenly into a shared refuge. The deep, heavy smell of wood smoke, mixing with the bitter salt air, seeped slowly through the ancient floorboards, anchoring the vast room in a rich, sensory warmth. The fierce winter storm outside showed absolutely no signs of relenting, but the fire had gradually burned down to a thick bed of glowing, ruby-red embers. I sat cross-legged on the thick rug, completely swallowed by the protective weight of his cedarwood coat, watching the mesmerizing dance of the dying flames. Julian sat just a few feet away, his long legs stretched out toward the hearth. His raw, blistered hands rested loosely in his lap. He was staring directly into the glowing ash, his usually unreadable expression drawn tight with a heavy, deeply rooted exhaustion. The yellow firelight illuminated the harsh planes of his face, softening the rigid, winterstone mask he constantly wore. I quietly studied the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. My gaze eventually drifted downward, tracing the rough, calloused lines of his hands. Beyond the fresh, dark bruises from tonight's hammer strike, my eyes caught on something significantly older. Running diagonally across the thick center of his left palm was a pale, jagged scar. It was deep and remarkably uneven, entirely unlike the clean, precise surgical cuts of a medical procedure. It looked harsh, sudden, and deeply anchored in an old trauma. As if sensing the sudden weight of my silent observation, Julian slowly turned his hand over. His thumb lightly brushed over the raised white tissue of the old wound. The gesture was absent-minded, yet it carried an immense, suffocating gravity that instantly altered the atmospheric pressure in the room. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. I did not ask him a single question. I simply remained perfectly still, holding his gaze in the dim light, offering him the silent, unyielding patience he had shown me since the moment I arrived. "It wasn't an accident," he murmured. His voice was a low, cracking whisper that barely rose above the howling wind outside, yet it echoed with deafening volume inside the quiet stone room. He did not look at me. He kept his dark eyes locked intensely on the glowing embers, as if the fire held the ghosts he was finally preparing to confront. I tightened my grip on the heavy lapels of his coat, my heart completely stalling in my chest. "The scar?" I asked softly, my voice barely a breath against the ambient noise of the storm. He gave a single, rigid nod. The movement was slow, heavy with the massive weight of a decade of forced silence. "Marcus Sterling," he said. The name tasted like ash and bitter poison in the quiet space between us. I recognized it instantly. Sterling was the ruthless corporate entity, whose massive conglomerate had engineered the hostile takeover that ruined my father. He was the invisible, calculating architect behind the insurmountable debt that had ultimately forced my sale to this island. Before the stone walls, Marcus wasn't just a business partner, Julian continued, his gravelly voice dropping an octave, heavy with a melancholic yearning for a reality that no longer existed. He was family. We built the early foundations of the Ashford Empire together from nothing. I trusted him with the absolute core of my life, my finances, my security, my future. He stopped, his jaw locking so tightly, I could see the dense muscle ticking beneath his skin. His thumb continued to trace the jagged white line on his palm, pressing deeply into the old trauma, as if trying to physically ground himself in the present moment. I did not move. I did not offer hollow, generic words of comfort. I knew perfectly well that deep systemic betrayal could not be soothed with empty platitudes. "I was engaged," Julian said quietly. The words dropped between us like heavy, cold stones. The woman I intended to marry was elegant, brilliant, and entirely woven into the fabric of the company. I thought we were building an empire that would last generations. I thought the people sitting at my dining table were my absolute sanctuary against the corporate sharks we fought every day. A fierce, violent gust of wind slammed against the tall glass windows, causing the massive wooden frames to groan under the immense pressure. Julian didn't flinch. He remained entirely anchored to the dark memories, playing out in the dying fire. I thought of the sea glass jar resting on my bedroom windowsill, a small collection of broken things washed clean by the tide. We were just like those fragments, shattered by the hands that should have held us. "I came back from a foreign acquisition trip 3 days early," he whispered, his voice hollow, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "I walked into my own home, my own sanctuary. I found Marcus standing in my private study. My fiancée was with him. They weren't just discussing corporate strategy. They were actively finalizing the legal documents to completely strip my voting rights, dissolve my primary holdings, and transfer the core assets into Marcus's offshore accounts. She had given him the private access codes to everything I had spent 10 years building. Cold nausea washed over me. I pulled my knees tighter against my chest, the heavy wool shielding me from the chill, but offering no defense against the horrifying reality of his words. They hadn't just stolen his wealth. They had deliberately assassinated his ability to trust. I was holding a crystal whiskey glass. Julian continued, his voice terrifyingly calm, detached from the raw pain of the memory. I remember the exact weight of it in my hand. When I realized what they had done. When I looked into the eyes of the man I considered a brother, and the woman I was preparing to marry, and saw absolutely nothing but calculated greed. I didn't shout. I didn't throw them out. He raised his left hand, the jagged white scar glowing faintly in the dim amber light. The crystal glass shattered under the sudden pressure of my grip, he said quietly. I stood there in the silent room, letting the broken pieces fall to the heavy wool rug. The physical sting in my hand was nothing compared to the absolute cold settling in my chest. I finally the fundamental truth of the world. Love is a liability. Trust is an unhedged risk. People will always look at you and calculate exactly how much your destruction is worth to their own bottom line. He dropped his hand back into his lap, the sudden movement heavy with an absolute, crushing defeat. The intimidating, stoic billionaire completely vanished, leaving behind a deeply traumatized, fiercely isolated man who had spent a decade locking himself inside a stone fortress just to survive the agonizing fallout of human connection. That is why I bought this island, Julian whispered, finally turning his head to look directly into my eyes. His dark gaze was impossibly vulnerable, stripped entirely of its defensive winter frost. That is why there is a heavy iron gate, and why I gave you the master ring of keys. I didn't bring you here to be my prisoner, Elena. I brought you here because the world out there is fundamentally broken, and I refuse to let it destroy anyone else under my protection. Hot tears pricked the corners of my eyes. A sudden realization settled heavily in my chest. We were exactly the same. Arthur Vance had treated my life as a mathematical equation to balance his debts, selling my autonomy to save his pride. Marcus and the woman Julian loved had treated his heart as a corporate asset to be liquidated for profit. We had both been commodified. We had both been utterly destroyed by the people who were supposed to be our safe harbors. I didn't offer a dramatic confession. I didn't rush forward to throw my arms around his neck. Instead, I slowly reached out from beneath the heavy folds of the cedarwood coat. My trembling fingers crossed the small, terrifying physical distance between us on the thick rug. I found his raw, blistered left hand resting in his lap. Slowly, deliberately, I pressed my palm flat against his. I aligned the smooth, unbroken skin of my hand directly over the deep, jagged white scar of his betrayal. He inhaled sharply, a sudden intense shudder racking his broad frame. He stared down at our joined hands, his dark eyes wide with a quiet, terrified disbelief. He had spent 10 years hiding his wounds behind impenetrable walls of cold stone and heavy iron, utterly convinced that if anyone ever saw his true vulnerability, they would immediately exploit it. They were wrong, I whispered fiercely, my voice steady, anchored by a sudden unyielding strength I didn't know I possessed. I squeezed his scarred hand, my small fingers wrapping tightly around his wide palm. You are not a liability, Julian. And this island isn't a fortress anymore. The roaring, violent coastal storm outside the tall windows continued to tear relentlessly at the edge of the world. But inside the quiet, dim glow of the stone hearth, the impenetrable, frozen armor surrounding my husband finally shattered completely. He bowed his head, resting his forehead gently against the back of my small, warm hand, and for the first time in a decade, he let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded exactly like peace. Home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. The howling wind outside the tall windows finally began to lose its violent edge. The deafening roar that had battered the ancient stone walls for hours slowly exhausted itself, transforming into a steady patter of rain down the dark interior of the chimney. Inside the amber glow of the living room, the absolute silence between us stretched out, heavy and sacred. The man kneeling on the thick woven rug kept his head bowed. The rigid tension that had defined his broad shoulders for the last 10 years seemed to physically drain out of him. I did not pull away. I didn't utter a single syllable to disrupt the fragile peace he had found. I simply sat there, enveloped in the massive weight of his cedarwood coat, and let my thumb lightly stroke his calloused knuckles. Slowly, Julian lifted his head. His dark eyes were clear in the flickering firelight, entirely stripped of the terrifying winter stone mask he usually wore. He looked at me not as a piece of financial collateral, but as an absolute equal. We were both broken things washed up on this rocky, isolated shore, scarred by the people who were supposed to be our safe harbors. He had offered me the raw truth of his deepest betrayal. It was time to offer him mine. I didn't have a massive corporate empire to lose, I began softly, my voice barely a whisper against the crackle of dying pine logs. I didn't have offshore accounts or a board room of colleagues. But I know exactly what it feels like to be calculated, Julian. I know what it feels like to look into the eyes of someone you love and realize they are secretly running the math on your existence. His jaw tightened fractionally. He didn't interrupt, but his large blistered fingers gently shifted, slowly intertwining with mine, to silently anchor me to the present moment. His warm, rough thumb brushed over my knuckles, a sudden, jarring contrast to the cold, thin pencil I used to hold when calculating my childhood debts. I didn't say the rest aloud. I didn't need to force the agonizing details into the quiet room. In the heavy stillness, my mind drifted back to that suffocating mainland house. When my mother first got sick, the medical bills had swallowed our lives whole. Arthur Vance wasn't a malicious man, but terror makes people incredibly cold. By the time I was 10 years old, I realized my father saw me as nothing but an extending line of credit, a mounting, unavoidable debt. I remembered finding a faded blue wire-bound notebook. Every single night, with a dull graphite pencil, I had kept my own secret ledger, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. I calculated my exact cost to him. $14 for a winter coat, $20 for weekly dinners, the exact cents for my desk lamp. I had get breakfast so the grocery bill would be lower, and worn my school shoes, until the soles broke through to the pavement. When I finally spoke again, the words fell rhythmically into the empathetic stillness. I spent my entire childhood trying to amortize my own existence, I confessed, the last remnants of my defensive armor falling away. I tried to shrink. I tried to take up as little space as possible. But no matter how small I made myself, the debt just kept growing. So when Arthur finally pushed that marriage contract across his desk, I didn't fight him. He sold me, because he finally found a way to balance the book. My entire life was just a liability waiting to be settled. Julian didn't speak immediately. He didn't offer a grand rebuttal, nor did he try to aggressively invalidate the pain I had carried for so long. Instead, he unlaced our fingers, lifted both of his hands, and gently cupped the sides of my face. His palms were warm, rough with fresh blisters from the heavy iron hammer, yet his touch was impossibly gentle. "You are not a transaction, Elena," he whispered fiercely, his voice dropping into a rough register that vibrated with absolute certainty. His dark eyes locked onto mine. "You never were. They looked at you and saw a cost. I look at you, and I see the only real thing left in this entirely broken world." He slowly lowered his hands, resting them gently on my shoulders, over the thick wool of his cedarwood coat. The cynical worldview that Marcus Sterling had beaten into him 10 years ago was finally losing its grip. "This is how you pay me back," he said quietly, his voice carrying the deep weight of a lifelong vow. "You stay. You take up space. You never shrink yourself in this house again." That midnight conversation did not end our isolation, but it profoundly changed the silence between us. Over the next 3 months, the violent winter storms gradually exhausted themselves, giving way to the fragile, pale thaws of early spring. What began as silent, cautious offerings, a repaired floorboard, a fresh towel left by the door, gradually wove into an unbreakable daily routine of unspoken trust. Julian continued mending the estate with silent acts of service, always leaving an insulated stainless steel thermos of hot pine tea on the porch for my solitary morning walks. In return, I walked the rocky shorelines, collecting sea glass in a simple sea glass jar, placing the smooth, weathered shards on the stone mantel as tiny physical markers of our shared survival. We didn't rush. The bitter, sterile cold of our transactional arrangement slowly melted into a profound domestic warmth. By the 3rd month of our marriage, the island no longer felt like a fortress meant to keep the world out. It felt like a home meant to keep us safe, and I finally felt ready. One morning, the aggressive blackness of the coastal night gave way to a fragile golden sunrise that bled softly across the eastern horizon. The churning gray waves of the Pacific Ocean settled into a slow, rhythmic swell. The heavy storm clouds broke apart, revealing a stunningly clear sky that smelled fiercely of salt, ozone, and wet earth. The main living room was freezing. The ambient heat of the fire had faded to a glowing bed of ruby-red embers beneath gray ash. I stood up from the woven rug, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The cedarwood coat still hung securely around my shoulders. Julian remained on the rug, resting against the heavy leather armchair, watching my every movement with quiet patience. I walked slowly out of the living room and ascended the grand staircase. The pale morning sun guided me down the long, silent hallway to my bedroom. I walked directly to the heavy wooden nightstand. Resting right beside the master ring of keys was the pristine, leather-bound folder that had arrived with my luggage on my very first day. I picked it up. The physical object felt incredibly heavy in my hands, completely out of place in the raw, natural beauty of this sanctuary. I opened the thick cover, staring down at the stark white parchment inside. It was the official, notarized copy of the debt ledger. My father's signature sat at the bottom of the page in sharp black ink, a legally binding anchor to a life of commodification. I carried the folder back down the stairs. When I re-entered the living room, Julian had not moved. His intelligent eyes tracked the heavy document in my hands. He didn't ask what I was doing or assert any legal ownership over the paperwork. He understood the profound necessity of the physical act I was about to perform. I knelt directly in front of the stone hearth. The dry heat of the deep embers radiated sharply against my face. I didn't hesitate or read the agonizing financial terms one last time. I simply leaned forward and dropped the entire debt ledger directly into the glowing red center of the dying fire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the intense heat caused the thick leather cover to slowly curl inward. A thin ribbon of dark gray smoke rose toward the stone chimney. Suddenly, the dry parchment caught. A bright, fierce flame erupted from the center of the book, rapidly consuming the sharp black ink, the clinical legal jargon, and the heavy, inherited shame of Arthur Vance's financial ruin. I watched the pages turn brown, then a brittle, skeletal black, before finally disintegrating entirely into weightless gray ash that drifted harmlessly up the chimney. It was gone. The transaction was completely ended. I was no longer a piece of collateral, and the powerful man behind me was no longer my warden. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the suffocating weight of 2 decades of scarcity finally lifting from my lungs. I stood up and turned around. Julian was looking at the empty hearth, a faint, deeply peaceful shadow of a smile touching the harsh corners of his mouth. We walked together toward the heavy oak front doors. Julian unlocked the massive iron deadbolt with a satisfying click and pulled the heavy wood inward. The damp, freezing air of the spring morning rushed into the foyer, carrying the fresh scent of crushed pine needles and wet soil. The sprawling wooden porch, overlooking the eastern cove, was soaked, littered with small branches, but the world felt entirely new. "Wait here," Julian murmured softly, stepping away toward the dark kitchen. I stood alone on the threshold, pulling the lapels of his coat tighter around my neck. I looked out over the calm expanse of the Pacific. The jagged gray rocks below were completely washed clean. The massive wooden staircase he had been building stood half-finished on the cliffside, a raw monument to his silent devotion. It wasn't polished luxury landscaping. It was rough, heavy, and built with bleeding hands, which made it the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I heard the soft scrape of the kettle from the kitchen, followed by the quiet pour of boiling water. A few moments later, Julian returned. He wasn't carrying a silver serving tray or fragile porcelain cups. He carried a single heavy ceramic mug. Plumes of fragrant steam rose into the cold air, carrying the deeply earthy scent of fresh pine tea and sweet wild honey. He stepped out onto the damp wooden porch and sat down heavily on the top step, ignoring the freezing moisture soaking into his dark trousers. He looked up at me, his dark eyes entirely open, completely devoid of the winter stone armor he had worn for 10 years. I stepped out of the doorway and sat down directly beside him on the cold, wet wood. Our shoulders brushed lightly, a casual, comfortable proximity that would have been completely terrifying just 3 months ago. He didn't offer a grandiose, romantic declaration. He didn't try to draft a new, emotional contract to replace the financial one I had just burned. Instead, he simply held out the steaming ceramic mug. I took it from his bruised, calloused hands, letting the immense heat seep into my cold fingers. I took a slow, tentative sip of the bitter pine tea, feeling the warmth travel deeply down into my chest before passing the heavy mug back to him. We sat side by side on the damp wooden steps, silently passing the single vessel back and forth as the pale golden sun slowly climbed higher into the clear sky. There was no need for loud, desperate promises. The massive wealth of the Ashford Empire felt entirely irrelevant out here on the edge of the world. We had traded the cold, sterile luxury of corporate boardrooms for the simple, rustic warmth of a shared cup of tea on a wet porch. We were no longer hiding behind heavy iron gates and thick stone walls. We were simply choosing to stay in the quiet sanctuary we had built together from the splinters of our past. Julian took a final sip from the ceramic mug, resting his forearms casually on his knees as he looked out at the endless blue horizon. The harsh, defensive lines of his profile were completely relaxed, softened by the golden morning light and the profound, hard-won peace settling over the island. "Write the life you want," he said quietly, his low voice mingling beautifully with the gentle, rhythmic sound of the ocean waves lapping against the shore. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute, unwavering devotion. "I'll meet you there." I smiled, a genuine, completely unguarded expression that felt incredibly light on my face. I leaned my head sideways, resting it gently against the solid, warm muscle of his broad shoulder. He shifted slightly, adjusting his posture to fully support my weight, a silent, permanent vow of protection. The debt was gone. The heavy transactional burden of my past had burned away into nothing but ash. I had arrived on this remote, stone-carved island, fully expecting to find a cruel, calculating warden who would keep me locked away in a sterile cage. Instead, I found a deeply scarred, incredibly gentle protector who was willing to bleed in the freezing rain just to ensure I never stumbled on the rough edges of the world again. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel to sit with us again. May you always find the courage to walk away from the cold transactions of the world, and may you find a sanctuary where you never have to shrink yourself to be loved.